to Adelaide and catch up with Family First Senator Bob Day. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Oh, good evening.
Look, I want to talk to you about the Senate reforms and your move to actually challenge them in the High Court. That sounds like a pretty desperate measure after, of course, you lost the vote in the Senate to block them.
Well, I wouldn't call it desperate. I mean, let's be clear about what happened last week. The Liberals and the Greens and Nick Xenophon rammed through legislation in what they want, in what they hope will be the wiping out of minor parties and independents from the Senate. And we fought tooth and nail for over 30 hours, but in the end, they had the numbers and the law was introduced. But yes, you're right. That was last week. This week, I will be asking the High Court to rule that this new law is invalid.
Now, can you get a ruling on this before the election? Can you even get an indication from the High Court of whether there is a case here that they'll accept before an election is held? Or, well, we don't exactly know when the election is going to be held, but do you think you'll get some sort of response within the next 3 months, for instance?
I would think so. That's what happened in 2010. You might recall the enrolment, the rolls were closed within a short time of announcing the election, and that led then to the potential disenfranchising of many hundreds of thousands of young people in particular. And I think it was Get Up who actually launched the High Court challenge.
So, sorry, just to interrupt then, you're suggesting the court will take heed of the urgency here, the fact that there is a looming election, and will turn its mind to this very quickly? Well,
it's better to do it beforehand than after. We saw what happened after the Western Australian election. They ordered a rerun there when it was found that just 12 or 1,300 ballot papers went missing, and that potentially could have affected the outcome. So the High Court ordered a rerun of the election. It would be much better for them to consider it before the election than afterwards, of course.
But on what grounds are you challenging these laws? Presumably, if you're going to the High Court and nothing's happened under these laws yet, you have to be arguing that they're unconstitutional.
Yes, a couple of points. There's the academic argument, which well-known psephologist and commentator on electoral matters Malcolm McKerris has made the point very strongly that this new law would be in breach of Section 7 of the Constitution, which requires that all senators shall be directly chosen by the people. Well, of course, this law, it's not senators who are directly chosen, but parties. And there is an important distinction. So there's the academic argument. There's also, based on the 2010 decision in the Get Up case and also 2013 in the Western Australian example, the democratic aspect where the potential disenfranchising of up to potentially 3 million voters could really capture the attention of the High Court. And if they considered that many voters were disenfranchised, then they may rule that the law is invalid.
But how can you say that voters are going to be disenfranchised under these new laws? These laws give more transparency. They allow voters to vote directly for the senators that they want to elect, and they can number preferences as many or as few as they like. But it's very, very transparent, and it's a very direct form of voters deciding the allocation of preferences in the Senate rather than backroom deals.
Well, it sounds like you've swallowed the government's line, hook, line and sinker.
Swallowed the coin. Well, you know, to be fair, you've got the government, the Greens, and we know that the people who led this debate for the Labor Party too supported these reforms. So there's a broad brush of people who suggest that these reforms are worthwhile, and it is a fact, is it not, that voters have the opportunity to directly allocate their preferences without any of these backroom preference deals getting a look in.
It's just the opposite. What you've just described is what happens below the line. You can number 1 to 12 below the line and direct your preferences to whomever you wish. But what these new laws now deny, they take away the voters' rights to delegate to their favourite minor party the distribution of their preferences. And the effect will be that most people will just put a 1 above the line. And I tried very hard last week to make an amendment that would make it an offence to encourage or promote or advertise people to just vote one above the line, because basically that's what the effect will have. People will continue to vote just one above the line, and those 3 million voters, their votes will die. I mean, the government seems very keen on the effects test principle. We heard that last week. And the effect of this legislation is that 25% of the electorate, 3 million voters, will put a 1 next to their favourite minor party, and their vote will go nowhere. So the idea of a single transferable vote, where if your first choice doesn't get in, your vote can then be transferred to the second and third, will all disappear.
Except Senator Bob Day, that every voter has that choice. If a voter wants to allocate preferences, then they have that choice with the pen in the ballot paper to allocate preferences any way they like. So it's their choice not to allocate preferences.
No, that's not. They've always had that choice below the line.
Yes,
but
of course. And they still have that choice now above the line and below it.
In fact, you've virtually duplicated. There's virtually no difference between above the line and below the line now. If
agreed. They may as well just have the one ballot paper and ask you to number up to 6 preferences. But it comes back to this point. I know what you're saying is in effect that a lot of people will choose not to exercise the preference, the right to allocate preferences. But the point is that they have that option. If I want to allocate a number against every box there, I can, or if I want to just give preferences to my favourite 6 or 7 candidates, I can.
But that's the whole point of the effect of this will be that they have their right to delegate the distribution of their preferences has now been removed. So they have been disempowered. And if people are not happy with the lack of transparency, or they don't know where their preferences might end up, then they can vote 1 to 12 below the line. But by taking away a voter's right, and I know many in my party, voters who support Family First, and I know lots in other parties, members say to their favourite minor party, look, I don't understand anything about preferences, but look, I'll put a 1 in the box above the line, and you distribute the preferences whichever way you wish, which is in the best interest of the party. That has now been removed. And the effect will be that up to 3 million votes now will die because they have nowhere to go. And that's this is not a consequence, Chris. This is an objective. This is what they want.
Well, it is an objective that you understand the situation. Now, you got almost 4% of the primary vote to get into the Senate, which is a lot better than some of your colleagues did. I mean, we're talking about Ricky Muir, who got about half of 1% of first preference votes, yet ends up a seat in the Senate. I mean, there has to be some reform to prevent these aberrations occurring, where people that voters have not voted for, except for about 500 of them directly, through very opaque and obscure preference deals, end up holding these precious seats in the Senate.
Well, the major parties get 75% of the vote, and they want 100% of the seats. Now, the 25% of the electorate vote for minor parties. What do? Do we just give the major parties 100% of the seats? So it was written in the paper yesterday that these new laws will make it easy to get rid of pesky senators like me. But I'm only there because people voted for me. What they're really saying is these new laws will enable them to get rid of pesky voters.
The bottom line, though, Bob Day, the bottom line, though, is that in a double dissolution election, for instance, if you can convince 5 or 6% of the electorate to vote for you, you will get a Senate place. And that's not too hard a hurdle to ask of people, is it, to get into to get a Senate, win a Senate seat, to win perhaps 1 vote in every 20.
The only reason that I might be returned is because I'm already in there, but this rules out any possibility of any new parties. There'll be no new environmental parties, there'll be no new, shall we say, no pokies parties. No other new party will ever get a look in after this. And you sound like these football supporters who complain because the other team won even though you kick more goals. You know, the points and goals add up. First preferences, everyone's obsessed with first preference.
No, I mean, you're right. Votes. I mean, there's no arguing that Ricky Muir and others were elected correctly according to the existing rules, but I'm just putting to you the arguments supporting these changes. We do need to go, but just briefly before we let you go, Bob Day, do you think that the Turnbull government is going to call a double dissolution election? I mean, what's in it for them? They're going to have to rush. It's going to be very complicated. They're not going to get control of the Senate anyway. Why wouldn't they just take their time and have an election in August or September?
Well, I think from a practical point of view, I don't think they've got time. The Senate doesn't return until the 10th of May. He has to call an election on the 11th and can't call it an early double dissolution election until the budget, the supply bills have gone through the Senate. Are we going to be expected to consider all these important supply and budget legislation in less than 24 hours? I wouldn't have thought so.
All right, Bob Day, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
That's Senator Bob Day, the Family First Senator from South Australia. As you can hear, very passionate about these changes to Senate voting rules. He's absolutely right. They are going to make life incredibly tough for minor parties and independents to get into the Senate, but all the major parties support that. It's going to be interesting to see how he goes with that High Court challenge. Now, after the break, we're going to catch up on the Indigenous recognition debate. It's kind of fallen off the agenda a bit. Is there any chance that this referendum proposal is going to come to a head next year? Back